The day I changed a thief's life. I was walking home late at night. The streets were empty, the air was cold, and the wind made my jacket move. The street lights were weak, and the shadows were long. My footsteps were the only sound in the quiet night. I pulled my jacket close to my body and kept walking. Everything seemed normal, but then I felt something strange. It was a feeling I could not explain. Someone was behind me. I stopped for a moment. The sound behind me stopped too. My heart beat faster. I turned my head a little and saw a man. He was walking fast. His hands were in his pockets. His head was down, but he was looking at me. I felt nervous. Maybe he was just going the same way. Maybe it was nothing. But deep inside, I knew something was wrong. I started walking again, faster this time. The man also walked faster. My hands felt cold. My legs felt heavy. I turned a corner hoping to lose him. But when I looked back, he was still there. His eyes were dark. His face was serious. He was not just walking. He was following me. Fear filled my body. My mind told me to run, but my legs did not move. The man got closer. Then I saw something in his hand, a knife. My breath stopped. My body froze. He pointed the knife at me. His voice was low but strong. "Give me your money," he said. I looked at him. He was young, maybe a little older than me. His clothes were old. His shoes had holes. His hands were shaking. His eyes were not full of anger. They were full of something else: fear, sadness, desperation. I reached into my pocket. I had some money. I could give it to him and walk away. But something inside me stopped me. This man was not just a thief. He was something more. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I took a deep breath. My heart was still beating fast, but my fear started to change. I looked at the man again. His hands were still shaking. His eyes moved from my face to the street, then back to me. He looked nervous. He did not want to hurt me. He just wanted something: money, food, maybe a way out of his problems. I knew that feeling. I had seen it before. Slowly, I reached into my pocket. The man watched me carefully. I could see his fingers tighten around the knife. I pulled out my wallet and opened it. I had some cash. Not much, but enough for him. I held out the money. He grabbed it quickly, but I did not let go. He looked at me with confusion. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was rough but not strong. I looked into his eyes. "Are you hungry?" I asked. He did not answer. He just stared at me. I could see the battle in his mind. He wanted to run, but something kept him there. Maybe no one had ever asked him that before. Maybe he did not know how to answer. The silence between us grew heavy. The night felt colder. Finally, he nodded. It was a small movement, but I saw it. I took another deep breath and made a decision. "Come with me," I said. He looked shocked. "What?" he asked. His grip on the knife loosened a little. "Come with me," I repeated. "I'll buy you some food." For a moment, he did not move. His eyes searched my face, looking for a trick, looking for a reason to run. But there was nothing, just honesty, just an offer. Slowly, he lowered the knife. His hand shook as he put it in his pocket. He looked down at the money, then back at me. "Why?" he asked. His voice was softer now. I gave a small smile. "Because I think you need help more than I need this money." He stood there for a few seconds, thinking. Then, without a word, he nodded again. And together we started walking down the empty street. We walked in silence. The streets were quiet, and the cold wind touched our faces. The man walked beside me, but he kept his distance. His hands were still in his pocket. His eyes moved from side to side as if he was ready to run at any moment. I understood his fear. He did not trust me. Maybe he thought this was a trick. Maybe he thought I would call the police. But I had no plan to do that. I just wanted to help. After a few minutes, we reached a small diner. The lights were bright, and the smell of warm food filled the air. I opened the door and stepped inside. The man hesitated. He looked at the door, then at me. His body was tense. He was not sure if he should follow. I waited. I did not say anything. I just looked at him, showing that he had a choice. Finally, he took a deep breath and walked in. The diner was almost empty. A woman behind the counter smiled at us. "What can I get you?" she asked. I looked at the man. "Order whatever you want," I said. He stared at the menu on the wall. His hands were still in his pockets. His eyes moved quickly over the words, but I wasn't sure if he was really reading them. After a moment he spoke. "A burger," he said quietly. Then he added, "and fries." His voice was different now, almost unsure, like he was not used to asking for things. I nodded. "And a coffee," I said to the woman. She wrote it down and walked away. We sat at a small table in the corner. The man kept his eyes on the table. His fingers tapped against his leg. He was nervous. He was not used to this. I wanted to ask him questions, but I didn't want to push him. Instead, I waited. Finally, he spoke. "Why are you doing this?" His voice was quiet, almost suspicious. I thought for a moment. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing," I said honestly. He looked at me for the first time since we sat down. His eyes were full of questions, but he did not ask them. Instead, he just nodded. The food arrived and he ate quickly. He did not talk. He did not look up. He just ate, as if he had not eaten in days. I watched him, but I did not say anything. This was not the time for words. This was the time for food, warmth, and a moment of peace. He ate fast, almost too fast. It was clear that he had not eaten a proper meal in a long time. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the burger. He took big bites, barely chewing before swallowing. The fries disappeared quickly. I sipped my coffee and watched him, not saying a word. He did not look up, did not slow down. He was focused only on the food in front of him. After a few minutes, the plate was empty. He sat back in his chair and let out a small breath. It was the first time I saw him relax, even just a little. He wiped his hands on his pants and finally looked at me. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but sincere. I nodded. "You're welcome." There was a pause. Then he spoke again. "I haven't eaten like this in weeks," he admitted. I leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" I asked. He looked down at the table, his fingers tracing a small crack in the wood. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer, but then he let out a deep breath. "I lost my job," he said. "Didn't have money for rent, got kicked out. After that, everything got worse." His voice was calm, but there was pain underneath. "I listened carefully," he continued. "At first, I thought I could find another job, but no one wanted to hire me. I slept in shelters when I could, on the streets when I couldn't, and then one day I was just hungry, desperate." He looked up at me. "That's when I saw you." His eyes held something different now. Regret. Maybe shame. I nodded slowly. "You didn't want to hurt me?" I said. It wasn't a question. He shook his head. "No," he admitted. "I just didn't know what else to do." The weight of his words hung between us. The diner was still quiet. The woman behind the counter wiped tables, not paying attention to us. Outside, the street lights glowed softly. After a moment, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet again. He tensed, but I did not take out money. Instead, I took out a small card and placed it on the table. "This place helps people like you," I said. "They give food, shelter, and even help find jobs." He looked at the card, but he did not touch it. His fingers curled into fists. "I don't want charity," he said, his voice tight. I gave a small smile. "It's not charity. It's a chance," I said. "A chance to start over." He stared at the card for a long time. His breathing was slow, deep. I could see the war inside him, the part that wanted to take the chance and the part that was afraid to believe in it. He stared at the card for a long time. His fingers hovered over it but did not touch it. I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He wanted to take it, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. Maybe he had tried before and failed. I did not rush him. I let him think. The diner was still quiet. Outside, the night was getting colder. The streets were empty, just like before. Finally, he let out a deep sigh and picked up the card. He turned it over in his hand, reading the name, the address. "You really think they can help me?" he asked. His voice was uncertain. I nodded. "Yes," I said simply, "but only if you want the help." He frowned and looked away. He was fighting an internal battle. I understood. Change was scary. Trust was hard. He put the card in his pocket. He did not say anything, but that small action meant something. It meant he was thinking about it. That was enough for now. I finished my coffee and looked at him. "Where are you staying tonight?" I asked. He let out a small, dry laugh. "Nowhere," he said. "Like always." His words were casual, but I could hear the sadness underneath. I thought for a moment. "The shelter on this card, it's not far from here," I said. "They take people in at night." He shook his head. "I don't know," he muttered. "I don't want to go somewhere and get kicked out again." His voice was quiet, almost like he was talking to himself. I understood. He had lost a lot, maybe more than I knew. Trusting people again was not easy, but I could not force him. I could only offer. "You don't have to decide now," I said, "but think about it." He did not respond right away. His eyes stayed on the table. I waited. Finally, he spoke. "Why do you care?" His voice was softer now, not suspicious like before, just curious. I thought about my answer because someone once helped me. I said, when I had nothing, when I was lost, and it changed everything. He looked at me for a long time. His expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. I reached into my pocket one last time and took out a few bills. I placed them on the table and pushed them toward him. "This is not for stealing," I said. "This is for starting over." He hesitated, then picked up the money. He held it carefully, as if it was something fragile. His eyes met mine. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "Just use it well." He nodded again, slower this time. Something in his face had changed. The fear, the desperation, it was still there. But now there was something else. Hope. For a few moments, we sat in silence. The money was still in his hands. The card was still in his pocket. He looked down at the table, deep in thought. I could see the struggle on his face. He had spent so long surviving, fighting, running. Now someone was offering him a different path, and he did not know if he could take it. I waited, not wanting to rush him. This was his decision to make. Finally, he took a deep breath and put the money in his pocket. "I'll go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll try." It was not a promise. It was not a guarantee. But it was something. It was a step. I nodded, showing him that I understood. "That's all you need to do," I said. "Try." He pushed his chair back and stood up. I did the same. The diner was still mostly empty. The woman behind the counter glanced at us but said nothing. Outside, the cold night waited. He hesitated, looking at the door, then back at me. "I don't know if this will change anything," he admitted. His voice was honest, uncertain. I gave him a small smile. "You won't know until you take the first step," I said. He nodded slowly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. I watched him go. He stepped outside, standing under the streetlights. For a moment, I thought he might change his mind, that he might disappear into the night like a shadow. But then, he looked at the card in his hand, took a deep breath, and started walking in the direction of the shelter. I stood there for a long time, watching him until he was out of sight. A part of me wanted to follow, to make sure he really went. But I knew I couldn't do that. This was his journey now. I had done what I could. The rest was up to him. As I left the diner and walked home, I felt something different inside me. I had almost been a victim tonight. My life could have taken a different turn. But instead, I had met someone who needed help more than I needed safety. And in that moment, I had made a choice. Not to run, not to fight, but to listen, to understand, to give. I never saw him again after that night. I never knew if he stayed at the shelter, if he found a job, if his life changed. But I like to believe that it did. I like to believe that sometimes one small act of kindness can be enough to turn a life around. And maybe, just maybe, that night was the start of something new for both of us.